David, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, giving me your time. Last year, in your presentation to Cambridge University's Economic Crime Symposium, you did say we can't stop everything and we shouldn't be pursuing that objective. So what should we or could we do less of, or what could we do more efficiently and effectively in terms of focus?
So it's interesting that the FATF talks about a risk-based approach. I would like to talk more about an intelligence-led approach, because that's getting more specific into what information you're sharing. And that's not necessarily about sharing topologies. That's useful, but there's a limit on the usefulness. But it's about sharing practical, actionable data. There are two things we want to see there. Firstly, if banks start doing more of that with the cooperation of FIUs and law enforcement, and then supervisors go in to look at that activity, you would expect supervisors, yes, to look at what banks have missed, but you would also expect them to look at what banks have found and give them credit for what banks have found, and not just turn it into a zero-sum game, which is, okay, you've missed this stuff. We don't care what you found, what you stopped, what investigations you've helped the police with. You missed these three things here. And so I think that's the biggest area.
So the less would be, it's the courage actually to be prepared to miss those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, because when FATF talks about the risk-based approach, they talk about focusing on the high-risk areas, zeroing in your resources to those high-risk areas. What they don't talk about is if you're doing that, by definition, you're not doing some other stuff.
Sure.
And that means you will miss some other stuff, and they have to go further, and regulators have to go further specifically and say, that's okay.
Do you know, sometimes that's communication. It's articulating in your policy. That's what we're going to do, and we understand the downside of it.
Yeah, we're not going to shoot you if you miss things, as long as you can demonstrate that you understand the risks, that your resources are targeted at where the highest risks are, and that they're proportionate. Your overall regime, your overall control measures are proportionate to the risks. We're not going to go in because you've missed some stuff at the bottom. And
this intelligence-led approach, I think some firms don't realise how much intelligence they have within KYC and the transactions they're executing for their customers. We spoke about it last night. 1989, when the FATF was created, who knew what a money launderer looked like? Maybe we have a better idea now. I think we certainly know what a money laundering account looks like. You and I go back to our days at Spring Garden when you were in the National Criminal Intelligence Service. I was on a crime squad. The Bank of New York case, 15 billion, credit-intensive account. So the money laundering risk in accounts, the primary risk is the credit, not the debit. So we can shift some of the transaction monitoring focus to say, really, you should be looking at the credits. And the intelligence, again, NatWest as a quote, NatWest were referenced in a Guardian article last year, 95% of their personal account customers never debit more than £5,000. That's incredibly powerful AML risk management intelligence, isn't it? If you use it properly.
So I think there's a real opportunity there to keep it simple. And I think sometimes, and maybe this is in the interest of the industry, we overcomplicate the machinery necessary to do this stuff. And I think there's a danger right now, particularly with the advent of some really powerful technology, that we just take bad practice from the past and we use the technology to do everything, try and capture all transactions, because it's just seen as a big data problem. But we don't plug in those bits of intelligence that can really target the machinery at where it can make a difference. I think you're right. I worry that we rush into improving the efficiency of bad practice. We don't pick up on those simple messages around cash, around credit, around the fact that you've got a customer who's maybe put in 3 suspicious credits over 6 weeks, as giving every single transaction the same degree of scrutiny, which is not a risk-based approach.
I've had many a wrestling match with technologists who would argue, look, this is a very smart piece of artificial intelligence. The more data you give it, the better it is. So give me all the transactions. To be honest with you, in my view, I'm surrendering my own AML experience and expertise to that. I'm giving it up. I'm saying, you don't need it all. I've already done internal analysis. Those 95%, what I want you to do there is tell me, just as you said, if I have 3 unusual transactions, yet to be defined what it is, in a 90-day period, those aggregated transactions will get me busy. But one single unusual transaction, I'm not interested in. Okay, so I'm still monitoring it, but it's a light touch monitoring. And I really want you to focus over here. As we said to Bob Mazur in an interview, you and I are both working through his new book, Bob Mazur never laundered money in his own name or even his undercover name. Why would you do that? Why bring attention to yourself? Money launderers with big money, the NatWest case is another example, use companies. Are we therefore putting too much focus on the individual customer and the personal account? That's clogging up our own arteries. Our own AML arteries are clogged up with these alerts that really have low value, literally low fiscal value, and therefore have low value law enforcement intelligence. We're missing it, aren't we? We need a rethink.
Yeah, so I think we definitely need a rethink. There are a few things there. There's too much focus on individual transactions and every transaction. There's not enough focus on the customer behavior over time, what could be flagged up, and understanding your customer across the business, because if you're a big bank, that customer may pop up in different guises in different jurisdictions. Do you have a single view of that customer? And then the point you made about the use of companies. I think there's still, we've seen it from FATF, and there's been a recent academic study to show that rules, for example, global standards on beneficial ownership haven't filtered down to effective understanding of how companies are misused and used on a regular basis for money laundering. We've got now commitments to registries in some countries around the world. Next month, we hope that FATF will adopt a new, stronger standard on beneficial ownership. Hopefully that will result in a bit more understanding of how companies are used and are more focused on that area. But you're absolutely right. That's an area that's woefully underlooked. It's where you can make a lot of headway very quickly.
And have you seen this individual accounts set against company accounts, credits set against debits, aggregating unusual transactions rather than single transactions? Have you seen that articulated or presented in any training anywhere?
One of the shortfalls of FATF evaluations is the whole process lasts 12 to 14 months. The on-site bit where a team of experts from around the world will go to a country for 2 or 3 weeks and question everyone involved in the regime. One of the shortfalls is they will spend a day out of that whole time speaking to the regulated sector. And that's banks, lawyers, accountants, casinos, estate agents, company formation agents, dealers in precious metals and stones. And obviously they will speak to those which present the greatest risks in the country, as identified if the country is done by a national risk assessment. But I think what it means is FATF don't look at that. Those conversations are probably not held at that level. They'll ask basic questions which will give some understanding about whether a regulated firm that's particularly noteworthy in that jurisdiction understands what customer due diligence is, and whether they have a basic understanding of their requirements from the regulator. That's about as far as we'll get. The level of detail you just talked about, FATF doesn't see.
No, but notwithstanding the constraints on FATF's time and the broad spectrum of things FATF has to look at, this doesn't stop any regulator, any country, any firm pursuing that.
No, and that's exactly what I think FATF would say it would expect and hope that regulators do. And what I hope is in the future, the FATF evaluations have more time to focus on supervision to improve that, because as I said, that's one area that has been woefully, underperforming in the AML regime.
2022 AML evolution is courage. Sometimes it's brutal decisions that, because imagine it, I'm suggesting that a major UK high street bank applies a very, very low level of transaction monitoring to 95% of personal account customers, 7.125 million accounts. If you did that and you keep the same AML resource level, look at the impact you can have where where the apparent higher level of risk is the companies, the individual accounts which are debiting more money, right, the international business, and cash. So it's this focus. I think we now need to look back and say, what have we learned in the past 30 years that we're going to take forward in the next 30 years to get those better outcomes and that effectiveness you talk to?
So I think a missing piece has been that real understanding of risk, both at the firm level, but also at the supervisory level. And maybe supervisors haven't been incentivizing or trusting firms enough to do their own risk assessment. Compliance officers working for banks can draw the confidence they need to take that kind of action if they've done a proper risk assessment. And if they shared that with the supervisor and they can get some confidence, they can justify it. And then I think they'll get the support.
So if an FIU or a country were to say to Kroll and David Lewis, we're thinking of applying a de minimis level, cut-off level for SARS, suspicious activity reports, if it's below a level of X, for money laundering, not terrorist financing, we both would say anybody who has any suspicion about terrorist financing and terrorism, irrespective of the value of the transaction, disclose it. That great police and Metropolitan Police say it may be nothing, but just tell us and we'll deal with it. But in money laundering, if somebody says, hey, we're going to go for a de minimis level, do you have a view on that?
There are challenges. Clearly, the system is clogged up, and it's probably clogged up with a lot of low-level stuff that may be adding little or no value. One of the challenges around it is we don't, in many countries, UK included, expect the person working in the bank to work out what the crime is that has led to that money coming in. It's an all crimes approach in the UK. Very difficult to expect a bank teller or Someone working in a bank to look at a transaction, to be suspicious and say, well, I'm suspicious because I think it's human trafficking, or I'm suspicious because I think it's X, Y, or Z. Maybe there is a connection there with de minimis. There may be circumstances where, you've got sophisticated criminal groups putting through a large volume of low-level transactions using technology, and you wouldn't want to miss those. So as long as you have a system in place to capture that, I think you could.
Why do they even need to do that? So, the mantra, if it's not broken, it doesn't need fixing. We really haven't broken the current money laundering models they use. They don't have to go to that level of sophistication.
No, but we know that some of them are starting to do it, and we know that it's possible. I guess the question is, again, it comes back to our understanding of risk. Of what we know, where are we most at risk? We can't stop everything. And if the biggest risk to our business is X, then that's where we should be focusing our resources. So maybe you're right. Just because it's technically possible and a money launderer can do it, doesn't mean we should have the same tightness of...
I've said this before. We need to move away from being hostage to what if, because what if is actually infinite, and therefore we won't achieve anything. What is what we should actually be looking at. But just so that the listeners know that we're connected into this, the actual SAR form filed to the NCA in the UK does invite you to, as the AML professional, to identify which type of crime you think it is. And actually, I always think in KYC, imagine if we asked the customers, what crime is it you're actually committing? I wonder that. So I've always said my default position is always tax evasion if I'm not sure, because it is a crime. And, I don't know what crime they're committing, but I just know it's not right.
It's a step further from the more difficult thing, which is what is the reason for your suspicion? And too many suspicious activity reports, transaction reports, are put in without a clear articulation of the reason for suspicion. That might be for various reasons. It might be an anomaly, someone's not sure, and therefore they think, well, just to be on the safe side, I'll put it in. And by putting it in, it gives them a degree of legal cover in many places, so you can't blame them for doing so. But consequently, you're clogging up FIUs and law enforcement with a load of stuff that the value of it is debatable. If you, as the person submitting the STR, are not clear on the reason for suspicion, how can you expect someone in FIU or law enforcement to be clear on it?
Sure, and sometimes the only person who can answer, I think, in the sequence, you're at a concern point that you're not fully suspicious. And at that concern point, sometimes the only party who has an answer to either make your concern crystallize as suspicion or for it to evaporate is the customer. In too many parts of the world, we've been trained that you can't talk to a customer, when in fact, to get better outcomes, you should. We spoke about this last night when somebody said, absolutely suspicious. There's a stolen car being driven down the road, arrest the driver. Actually, he's just recovered his car. Or he's just bought the car, he doesn't even know it's stolen. If you don't ask some questions and get some answers, the whole thing's blind.
Yeah.
So that conversation can be very powerful. And let's not forget, most of our customers are not money launderers. So don't we sometimes owe them a chance to give an explanation without fear? And maybe the training's gone wrong in that sense. But away from the negative, or everything you've looked at around the world, and the FIUs you've visited, countries you've visited, private sector, public sector, what have you seen over the last 6 years that you think is really good practice and you'd like to see replicated? And I remember we spoke before about the unexplained wealth orders, and we very complimentary of people in the public sector in the UK, in the background, working at saying, what more can we do? And at least they're innovative and trying ideas. But have you seen other things like that?
In many countries around the world, if I'm honest, they're still just setting up FIUs and getting them functional. And often FIUs have other responsibilities, supervisory responsibilities. But in those that are more developed, there's a mixture of good practice. I would pick a couple of examples. In the US, you've got Section 314B of the Patriot Act. That enables banks in a controlled framework to share information amongst themselves on potential suspicious activity. So when they put in a SAR to FinCEN, it's something that's worth FinCEN looking at. It's not just an anomaly that they have to try and work out how it fits and do analysis to work out how it fits. Giving banks the opportunity to talk to each other, to build a bigger picture, to connect the dots, to submit a real intelligence package and not just an anomaly is great practice. I think when I speak to banks, they think there's huge value in that gateway they have in the US. They also recognize and believe that it's probably underused and could be much better used. Other examples in the UK, you've got the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force that's been talked about a lot. Where I think the interesting thing is it's you co-locating people physically in the same room with access to their systems, people from the FIU, people from banks, and they're able to share information in real time. And so this is no longer a kind of binary transaction where a SAR goes in, you have to wait for a number of days to see if you get something back or not. You can have the conversation in real time. And often it's not about the SAR. It's about sharing other information. You talked about the wealth of information that banks have got. It's probably the biggest source of information that's available anywhere in the AML regime. It's not being properly tapped at the moment. Enabling these partnerships, these public-private partnerships where information and intelligence, make a difference between the two, can be shared in a safe way, in a trusted way, with a proper legal framework around it. We're starting to see it proliferate. And I think it offers huge hope. It's not often that scalable, and it's not yet happened with the professional enablers, the gatekeepers, the lawyers, the accountants, and so on, some of whom are quite keen to have those kind of relationships. But I think the opportunities there for public-private partnerships and gateways to enable information intelligence sharing are great. We need to see them happening across borders. I'd love to see, I know Rob Wainwright at Europol, when he was there, was really pushing to have a pilot of that. But it's really difficult, even within Europe, and a lot of that comes down to data protection and privacy concerns.
Another area for listeners to look at is, I think you should always be looking at and aware of what are the terms and conditions of business your firm have with customers and what do they allow you to do. And if they're lacking, change them. Because in truth, the one we speak about regularly is the airport, right? KYC is core to what they do. They screen all their customers against sanctions list, and the transaction is actually the suitcase, so they monitor that. But they don't open every single suitcase, And so within that context of how do we share intelligence? They share it all the time, internationally, with the airline and the airport. Most importantly, in their communication, they bring the customer on board. The customer is well aware of what's going on, why it's going on. The customers become deputies at the airport looking for bags left by themselves. Part of our education as firms and, part of the 2022 objective is make the public more aware of why AML is good for communities.
Yeah, because you can do it in the airline industry because people see planes falling out of the sky.
Well, they don't, but it did happen. But
yeah, the threat is very real, and people can see the impact on them. You don't have that in the AML world. And that's why I do credit some of the efforts recently, like the United for Wildlife effort, which talks about money laundering through the illegal wildlife trade. If we can make it real for people, all of a sudden I think we'll get a lot more support. And you do need the support from customers. If you're going to change those terms and conditions, as you say, in order to get better information and start changing the system for the better.
But it's also protecting customers. So the smurfing, customers really, they should only be opening a bank account for their use, not for a third party's use. If they are persuaded by some charming individual, because let's be straight, all money launderers are charming individuals. I've never met a money launderer who's not a nice person. Perversely, it persuades them to use their account. We need to protect them and say, look, they may be tripping you up. You may end up committing a criminal offence. Moreover, we'll block your account and we may apply significant charges to you for any investigation we have to do. That's AML at work, right?
Yeah, and banks are quite good at that when it comes to fraud. When you're looking at money laundering, it seems that there hasn't.
I've got a theory on that. I mean, I think now, intelligence, when we spoke about intelligence, I know of some intelligence. I think now the word is protection, everything's protection. Protecting customers, protecting executives who are now under more pressure. Executives in the boardrooms know more about AML now because of personal pressure as well, and because it's costing their shareholders lots of money in two ways. The money they're spending and the money they could be fined, protecting customers to stop other people stealing their deposits, and the communities where we operate at their will. Because if the community doesn't like us, we're out of business. It's all about protection. If we can get that message across, positive energy, positive messaging, we'll get better outcomes, because they will, again, some of these customers will become our deputies and help us in our endeavours.
It's a great message, and I think you're absolutely right to point it out. We need to mobilise the customer base of banks, get them understanding why it is they're being asked for this information, how it's helpful, and what ultimately we're trying to achieve. And you need to give them the option to take action where they don't see that happening. Make it easier for them to move banks. I know this happened in the UK, but at the moment, if you see your bank's been involved in a money laundering scandal, are you really motivated to move banks? Which bank would you move to? Is it difficult to move banks? Yes, of course it is when you've got a mortgage and loans and everything. So, of course, banks may not be motivated to really act because they're not going to lose their customers.
No, but their shareholders are putting pressure on them. And we said this last night, ESG, environment, social and governance, and financial crime is a pure form of ESG. And at COP26, if it hasn't changed some executives, it's certainly changed the thinking of the public. And they are motivated to say, I want to be engaged with companies that are adhering to their ESG policies. Aviva investors are now holding executives where they invest. So there is a movement there. And I think the AML movement can attach itself to that.
I think it should do, because an important part of that is AML is a moral obligation for firms. It shouldn't just be seen as a legal and regulatory and compliance issue, something that firms have to do just because the regulators told them that they have to do it. And I think that's been the attitude for too long, and it's starting to change. It needs to be seen as an integral part of ESG. And I think CEOs are starting to get the importance of ESG. I don't think they've yet seen the connection between that and financial crime.
I think it's a great place to wrap this up, because we get down to that, your passion and its moral obligation as you raise your hand and thrust it forward, because that's where you're going. And the great news for people who are big fans of what you did at the FATF and who you are is nothing's changed about you. It's just you're going to be the same David Lewis. The light still burns brightly. You've still got the passion, but you're going to be more focused perhaps on single countries. You may have better opportunities to achieve these objectives. You don't need a consensus here. On behalf of everybody who's going to listen to this, I wish you well, and I look forward to speaking to you in a year's time to find out how it's going.
Thanks, Martin.